So, in Witch Queen we updated the light subclasses to match how stasis works, and today I'm going to talk about how they work, then some quick builds, then there'll be a bit at the end about how they've affected the game as a whole. First we have to talk about subclass verbs, as they will be a recurring thing with each subclass in the game. If you want you can just skip this bit, but you will be surprised how many people don't know what these actually do, which is why I'm going to talk about them. To start off, we have Void, which applies a debuff that lets you deal 15% more damage to enemies affected by it. Next is Suppress, which stops enemies from using abilities and stuns unstoppable champions. Then there's Volatile, which creates big void explosions, usually coming from volatile rounds, on void weapons, and can be used to stun anti-barrier champions. Then there's Overshield, which gives you extra health. Finally, for Void, you have Devour, which is a buff that gives you full health from any kill whilst active, and refreshes the timer of it. Next up are Solar's subclass verbs, which are Radiance, which is a buff that lets you deal 25% more damage to enemies and stun anti-barrier champions. Scorch, which is a stacking burning debuff that gradually damages enemies, and eventually causes an ignition, which is a large explosion damaging anyone caught within its radius and stunning unstopped champions. Then we have Solar's two healing buffs, which are Cure, which is an instant heal that removes most debuffs applied to the player, and Restoration, which is just a healing over time effect. Then we have Arc's verbs, which include Jolt, a debuff that makes the target take slightly more damage, and when damaged, periodically release lightning that damages both itself and nearby enemies, and can also stun overload champions. Then there's Blind, another debuff that obscures the vision of players and stops combatants from shooting. Blind also stuns unstoppable champions. Then there is Amplified, a movement speed and handling buff activated from killing enemies of arc damage, or sound fragments and aspects. After sprinting for a period of time, the movement speed of the buff is increased. With all the verbs out of the way, we also have to talk about the elemental pickups for each element. For Arc, there are Arc Traces, which travel towards the player and grant ability energy when picked up. And there are Fire Sprites for Solar, which linger on the ground and grant grenade energy when picked up, and are similar to Void Breaches, which again linger and grant class ability energy when picked up. So now, 10 minutes into the video, we can talk about the actual subclasses. So I will talk about each element on each subclass in order of release, going Void, Solar, and Arc. As said earlier, I will talk about what's new with each subclass, and then talk about builds and my opinions on them, before moving on to the next one. So let's start off with Hunter. Hunter in PvE got mainly upgrades from the 3.0s. Void was changed to just focus on invis. Solar is mainly gunplay and explosions, whilst Arc is just the best subclass of the three. Void Hunter was changed to be mainly invis and a debuffer. Example, Smoke Bomb was changed to weaken enemies when you hit them, being an incredibly easy source of weaken. Aspects are where the invisible part mainly comes in. Your first one is Trapper's Ambush, which allows your Smoke Bomb to make anyone near it invisible. And you also gain a Shatter Dive like Ground Slam, where you use your Smoke Bomb, slamming to the ground and applying its effects to anything nearby. Your second aspect is Vanishing Step, which now changes your dodge to one that makes you invisible when used. Your third aspect, Flawless Execution, incorporates both the debuffs and invisibility, as whenever you kill a debuffed target, you go invisible and gain True Sight, which lets you see through walls. Also, after activating Flawless Execution, your melee will weaken the next target you hit. Your tether was also split into 3 supers, one being Spectral Blades, where you just run around with knives and hit things, and the other being variants of tether. One, the longer lasting single shot, which now applies a 30% weaken, and the other being a 3-shot tether, which you can fire twice, that is a shorter but much higher damage super than the other variant. Hunter on its own isn't actually very fun without build crafting. The invisibility on its own isn't very useful outside of Legend of higher content, and Weaken is not exactly the most useful debuff outside of, again, high-end content and raids, as everything will die in about 2 seconds in most content. So the fun in playing Void Hunter comes from Gear Falcon's Hawbrook, an exotic chest piece which grants you volatile rounds whenever you go invisible that you can then combine with Stylish Executioner to create a loop of going invisible to get volatile rounds and then killing enemies to get Palmer Invis, and therefore more volatile rounds. You can combine it with fragments such as Echo of Starvation for Devour from Orbs and Void Breaches, Echo of Obscurity for Invis or Infinity kills, and Echo of Cessation to make nearby enemies volatile whenever you finish an enemy, alongside making Void Breaches whenever you kill volatile enemies. Devour into the loop effectively makes you unkillable, as you will just get full health whenever you go invisible, meaning if something manages to shoot you, you can just immediately reverse any sort of damage you've taken. Also, Volatile will just grant you very good crowd control, making it impossible for anything to shoot you, as they will probably be dead. You know, a very good build for lower to mid-tier content. However, in GMs, most people choose to use something like Omnioculus, as it will give you 2 charges of Smoke Bomb and therefore 2 charges of Invisibility, allowing you to easily get revives or keep the team alive by just making them constantly invisible. Void Hunter mainly shines in mid to higher tier content, as all the stuff Void basically provides is only really useful there. Next up is Solar Hunter, the one of 2 subclasses that managed to keep quite literally everything from before. You have one new dodge, being Acrobat's dodge, that grants you and nearby allies Radiant when used. Then have all 4 knives available, being a basic throwing knife that grants Radiant, a bigger knife that deals more crit damage and takes longer to throw but recharges your dodge, a knife you can attach to surfaces and explodes whenever it's near an enemy, scorching them and dealing more damage if you actually hit them with the knife. And the final one is a fan of 3 knives that scorch any enemy it touches. Your 3 aspects are On Your Mark, headshot kills grant you a stacking buff to reload and handling, which maxes out at 3 stacks, and instantly maxes out whenever you use your class ability. Knock 'em Down, which enhances your supers. Deadshot Golden Gun gains damage resistance, Marksman gains increased duration, and Blade Barrage launches more knives. Also, whilst Radiant, final blows with your melee refund it. And then you have Gunpowder Gamble, solo kills, which include weapons, debuffs, and abilities, charge up a bundle of trip mines, which can be thrown, dealing large amounts of damage, and scorch to anyone within its radius. And shooting it in mid-air causes it to ignite. Your supers are again split into 3 variants. Marksman Golden Gun, the basic free shot that can deal precision damage, and gains a stacking buff and orb generation for each precision hit. Deadshot Golden Gun, a 6-shot rapid-fire Golden Gun that has no precision damage, causing ignitions, refunds a shot. Both variants of Golden Gun benefit from Radiant and currently benefit from kinetic surges. Your final super is Blade Barrage, where you just launch 2 massive volleys of knives at enemies. Solar Hunter is probably the most fun, but also the least useful of the 3 Solar subclasses. However, this is not to say it's bad. In most of the game, running Solar Hunter is perfectly fine. The main 2 builds revolve around abilities and making stuff explode. The first one is Caliban's, which is as simple as using Knock 'em Down, Ember of Torches, Ember of Ashes, and Explosive Knife. Caliban's will make your Explosive Knife ignite enemies on kills, allowing for massive crowd control. Combining this with Ember of Torches and Knock 'em Down will then give your melee back on kills, allowing you to just spam it forever. The second build involves Yonga Hamkara's Spying, which buffs Trip Mine Grenades and makes it so ability damage will grant Trip Mine's ability energy. This includes any source of ability damage from your knife to Scorch and the Trip Mine itself. This will come back to haunt us when I talk about PvP. What you'll want to do is combine Trip Mines, Fan Knife, Gambler's Dodge, and Knock 'em Down, alongside Ember of Singeing, Ashes, and Torches to create a setup where you can just throw your abilities constantly and deal high damage from your Trap Mines. There's also a build for Lucky Pants that people tend to use Solar for due to its synergy with weapons, but I won't go into that as I wouldn't call it a Solar specific build. As you'll see when using these builds, Solar Hunter can be very good, however the other 2 subclasses basically do its job as well, if not better, far easier. Gear Falcon's Hunter isn't as good as Caliban's for ad clear, but Caliban's can only really be used in lower to mid tier stuff, unlike Caliban's which can be used basically everywhere. And Hamkara's is very good, essentially being the old Starfire Warlock build, but on Hunter. However, Arc Hunter can do its damage far easier, which is why I will now move to Arc Hunter. So, Arc Hunter, basically the best of the 3 subclasses with incredibly good survivability, damage, and ad clear, which can all be fit into a single build. Basically didn't really get anything new, other than an extra super, but the buffs to Arc and freedom to pick all the good stuff at once is really what makes it good. So you have the choice between Disorienting and Combination Blow. Combination Blow gives you a stacking melee damage buff and refunds your dodge whenever you kill an enemy, allowing you to use the Gambler's Dodge to play the game with pure melee. Your second option is Disorienting Blow, which just blinds enemies and gives you Amplified. Aspect choices are Tempest Strike, which if you sprint and then slide, lets you do a melee which sends a lightning strike forward, jolting anyone hit by it. You then have Flow State, which makes us amplified when killing jolted enemies, and whilst amplified, our dodge recharges faster, granting us damage resistance when dodging and increases our reload speed. Then you have Lethal Currents, which increases our lunge range after dodging, makes our melee jolt, and also has it create a damaging shock. It also makes it so if you melee a jolted target, it blinds them. 2 supers are Arc Staff, which is a roaming super that lets you hit people with a lightning pole, and Gathering Storm, a 1-use super that has you throw the pole wherever you're aiming, jolting anything hit by it. The pole, shortly after landing, will get hit with a lightning strike, damaging enemies and overcharging the pole, making it periodically damage enemies inside the radius. Basically just 2 ways to play Arc Hunter. One is Shinobi's Vow, where you put on Skip Grenades, Shinobi's, Ember of Spark, Firepower, and a Grenade Kickstart, and then just throw grenades at things. The next is the correct way, throwing on Gambler's Dodge, Combination Blow, Flow State, Lethal Current, and Gathering Storm. Then you have a choice of pairing with either Liar's Handshake for more damage or Assassin's Cowl for survivability. Personally, I would recommend Assassin's Cowl, as you'll already deal enough damage with just dual melees as base. With Assassin's Cowl in this build, it combines the Devour Invis part of Hunter with Arc Hunter's damage output and ad clear, making it basically the best build all around, and can even be used in some GMs with the right amount of setup. You could also throw on Starry Scales and Gathering Storm for the best damage super in the game. It's as simple to use as getting 4 orbs and hitting the boss, which is only be a slight struggle in Ghosts of the Deep. This will allow you to hit the same if not better damage than the Ahamkara's build for barely anywhere near as much effort as long as you have decent damage weapons. Overall, I'd argue Hunter is the most balanced of the 3.0s, of Solar and Void having clear upsides and weaknesses in PvE. However, Arc is very clearly much better than both the other 2 subclasses, and it would be nice to see it brought in line, as you can make most things significantly easier, especially solo content. You can quite literally get 10-minute close of Fallen Saber on Grandmaster with an Arc Hunter setup. You just need to be careful to do it without dying to environmental hazards, which I feel is just slightly silly. Next up is Warlock, which is a A-class in Destiny 2. With the 3.0s, they essentially gave away all of Warlock's special aspects to the other subclasses. Devour, Arc Web now being Jolt, and Healing on Solar now just being Restoration, Cure, and Healing Grenades, with basically getting nothing new added, and yet Warlock is still arguably the best class in the game. Void Warlock has been turned into a debuffer grenade class. Its aspects are Feed the Void, which grant Devour when killing an enemy with a Void ability, Chaos Accelerant, which lets you hold your grenade button to buff your grenade, with each grenade having different effects, and Child of the Old God. Placing your Rift grants you a Void Soul, which flies to the first enemy you damage with one of your guns. Once it reaches your target, it will weaken, slow, deal damage, and either give you ability energy or health, depending on which Rift you have on. Warlock's melee also got changed to an orb that slightly seeks enemies, making them volatile and knocks them back. Your super options are Cataclysm Nova, which is a high damage Nova that slowly seeks enemies, Vortex Nova, which is a lower damage Nova that sucks in enemies and deals large AoE, and Nova Warp, where you become a roaming Nova Bomb. Main 2 build options are either grenades or rifts. You can put on Nezareg Sin, Controverse Holds, or Nothing Manacles and use ability energy to spam grenades, or you can use Second Filaments with Void Soul and Chaos Accelerant to essentially get all 3 aspects. Void is arguably the weakest of the 3 subclasses and honestly just the least interesting, with no direct issues apart from just being very mid. Next up is Solar, which is the best Warlock subclass and arguably the poorest designed. Solar Warlock's new melee is Incinerator Snap, which fires 5 lava orbs in close range that inflict scorch stacks and can ignite enemies if you hit enough of them. You also have Phoenix Dive now as a class ability, which cures you and gives you restoration ×2 if you have Heat Rises on. Which then brings us to the aspects. You have Heat Rises, which lets you shoot whilst gliding and gives a passive 20 AE bonus. It also lets you consume your grenade for another 50 AE bonus, letting you glide far longer, and the buff can be refreshed by getting kills in air, which also grants melee energy. Next is Icarus Dash, which lets you do a dash whilst in the air. You also get Cure if you manage to rapidly kill enemies whilst in the air with your guns. And your last aspect is Touch of Flame, a better version of Warlock's Chaos Accelerant that buffs grenades by giving them certain gimmicks, depending on what grenade is thrown. For example, Solar Nades gain Lava Balls, Fusion Grenades explode twice, and Healing Grenades gain Restoration ×2 and a better Cure effect. Solar has only two super options, being Dawnblade, where you cast a fire sword and throw it at people, letting you Icarus Dash infinitely for its duration and making your Phoenix Dive deal damage, whilst also being on a shorter cooldown. You then also have Well of Radiance, which has you plunge your sword into the ground, creating a healing pool that also gives you radiant and damage resistance, as well as immunity to stasis effects while stood in it. Solar Warlock basically has three playstyles. Grenade Spam, where you use Sunbraces, Touch of Flame, Incinerator Snap, Ember of Searing, and Momentum Transfer to constantly be able to throw solar grenades, being by far the best build currently. Healer Warlock, which uses Lumina, Boost of the Assembler, Ember of Benevolence, Healing Grenades, Healing Rift, Well, Touch of Flame, and Heat Rises to have constant healing up, honestly being somewhat boring and ineffective despite Solar Warlock supposedly being a healer subclass. And you also have a Scorch build, utilizing Dawn Chorus, Ember of Ashes, Searing, Wonder, and Over Eruption or Charm, combined with Incinerator Snap, Touch of Flame, with either solar or fusion grenades, and finally an incandescent weapon, to essentially mimic the old bottom tree Warlock, being a fun but not as effective as Sunbrace's build. Solar Warlock is still, as said, the best Warlock subclass, having speed, ad clear, damage and survivability, and the best super in the game, Well of Radiance, being a staple in every raid team. However, it is just poorly designed. Dawnblade gets completely outshined by Well of Radiance's existence due to it being vastly more powerful, and the aspects, I don't even know what they were thinking with the aspect design. Here, Icarus Dash and Heat Rises are two separate aspects despite clearly being made to be used together. Icarus Dash's secondary trait relies on being able to shoot whilst gliding, and Heat Rises gives you a second Icarus Dash and feels terrible to use without Icarus Dash. These two being separate also stops Solar Warlocks from having a more unique third aspect, such as something healing or buff related, as they advertise the subclass as a healer subclass in the Solar 3.0 trailer. Personally, I think Bungie should remove the damage buff from Well of Radiance, combine Heat Rises and Icarus Dash, and then make a new third aspect. Because of balance reasons, there's no real reason for them to be two separate aspects. Now for the most fun subclass, Arc. The only new thing Arc Warlock got specifically is a new melee from an aspect. So, the aspects are Arc Soul, where you place a rift, can go into said rift, and gain an Arc Soul. The Arc Soul shoots things, and shoots things more if you get amplified. Electrostatic Mind. Arc ability kills, and killing jolted or blinded targets create an Arc Trace. Collecting Arc Traces then makes you amplified. And finally, Lightning Surge. Pressing your powered melee whilst sliding makes you teleport forward, calling down lightning strikes which jolt enemies. Your two super options are Storm Trance, a roaming super that lets you fire lightning from your hands, and Chaos Reach, a super where you fire a massive lightning laser from your hands. Arc Warlock only really has two main builds. The first being an ability-focused build of either Falling Sunstar or Crown of Tempests, where you just spam abilities and either focus on making arc traces or getting arc ability and jolt kills. The second being Vesper of Radius, being the background gameplay. You basically just put on Vesper, Arc Souls, and Electrostatic Mind, place your rifts in the middle of a bunch of enemies and kill them, and just repeat, which is a surprisingly very enjoyable build. Arc Warlock started off as very underpowered, but is currently a very fun subclass. I actually think it's in a pretty good place now. As said at the start of the section, Warlock basically didn't get anything new and had all its unique aspects added to the other subclass, Scorch being ripped basically from Bottom Tree Solar. And yet it is still basically the best subclass in the game. Finally, Titan, which got the best of 3.0s, so I'm going to go right into it. Void, a new melee in the form of shield throw, where you throw a shield that ricochets between enemies, dealing damage and granting you an overshield. Your aspects are Bastion, which makes your super and barricades give you and nearby allies overshields, and makes your barricades slowly regenerate said overshield. Then have Offensive Bulwark. Whilst you have an overshield or inside your bubble, your grenade charges faster, and your melee has increased range, damage, and melee kills, and extends your overshield duration. Finally, you have Controlled Demolition. Hitting targets with void abilities or volatile explosions makes them volatile. Further damage then causes them to explode. You and nearby allies also gain health whenever volatile enemies explode near you. Your supers are Sentinel, which has you run around with your shield, allowing you to throw a better version of the melee, and create a large barrier whenever you block, giving anyone behind it a 40% damage bonus. You also have Ward of Dawn, also known as Bubble, where you create a shielding bubble around yourself, which grants you and allies a 30% damage bonus. Void Titan is by far the weakest of the three, with limited but viable build potential, with it basically just being harder than most lights. Your other option is no backup plans, but isn't particularly viable in most of the endgame. With all this in mind, Void Titan isn't exactly just bad, it's just like Solar Hunter, where it gets outclassed. There's currently no reason to use Bubble when Will of Radiance exists. The Overshield spam is outclassed by Solar again, as the Overshield is just a 40% health increase compared to a constantly regenerating health, and therefore people just run Arc or Solar Titan for either damage or pure survivability. Which, speaking of, onto Solar Titan. You got one new thing in the form of an aspect, and said aspects are Sol Invictus. Solar ability kills, including Scorch, create a sunspot which makes your abilities charge faster, granting you restoration and making your super drain slower, and it damages enemies within it, scorching them. Then have Roaring Flames. Solar ability kills and ignitions increase the damage of your solar abilities for a full 20 seconds. This buff goes up to 3 stacks and can be instantly refreshed. Your third and final aspect, being the new one, is Consecration. While sliding, activate your charge melee to launch you and a wave of fire, which damages it and scorches enemies' heads. Still airborne, activate your charged melee again to slam into the ground, creating a second wave of fire which ignites any enemy's hit. The two supers are Hammer of Salt, where you throw a hammer at things, and Burning Maul, where you wield a bigger hammer and use it to hit things. You can also slam it to the ground, which creates a flaming tornado that chases enemies. Solar Titan's power mainly comes from combining Sunspots, Roaring Flames, and Throwing Hammer, a melee where you throw your hammer at enemies and can pick it back up afterwards to fully recharge it. This is the setup basically every Solar Titan uses, and every build will incorporate due to Roaring Flames and Hammers, letting you throw abilities at everything, with these Sunspots becoming a nice source of survivability and thrower ability energy. After putting these on, you can basically just use any aspect that incorporates solar. Those being Path of Burning Steps, which is nice for the solar surges but isn't as good as it was before due to being surges instead of just a flat solar damage buff. Phoenix Cranial is a nice support option, making your sunspots last twice as long, and makes it so your sunspots benefits also get passed along to allies whenever they go through a sunspot. There's Worm Gods and Synthoceps, which will then boost your throwing hammer damage. You also have Hallowfire Hearts, which will give you increased ability recharge when you have yours supercharged. And finally, Lorelei Splendor, which will make it so your barricade creates a sunspot when placed, and when you are weak will automatically place a sunspot on yourself, consuming your barricade and instantly giving you restoration for a longer duration than usual. Lorelei is the one most people use, as you can essentially become invulnerable without much effort, as you'll always have your barricade pretty much, and can have permanent restoration with Ember of Empyrean. Solar is mainly good for solo activities and activities where you're at a power disadvantage for its survivability, and is mainly the reason Ghost of the Deep is full of moths. For Arc Titan got a new class ability in the form of Thruster, a horizontal dash ability that takes the place of your barricade. Think like Doom Eternal, except you can only use it on the ground. Also got a new melee being Thunderclap, where you charge up a thunderous clap, damaging anything within its range and dealing more damage depending on how much you charge it up. Your aspects are Juggernaut, where after sprinting for a short time with a full barricade, you gain a frontal shield with 50 HP that blocks any damage that hits it. After it gets destroyed, your barricade is depleted, and whilst amplified, the shield's health is increased. Your second aspect is Knockout, critically wounding an enemy or breaking its shield, buffs your melee with Arc, and increases your melee range, damage, and makes your melee kill style health regen. Oh, and it also makes you amplified. Your last aspect is Touch of Thunder, which, like Warlock's Touch of Flame, buffs your grenades via giving them certain gimmicks. Storm grenades last longer, deal more damage, and travel after targets. Pulse grenades make ionic traces, and you gain 2 lightning grenades, for example. Your supers are Fist of Havoc, where you become charged of lightning and just run around punching and slamming on enemies, and your other super is Thunder Crash, where you become an arc missile and fly into enemies dealing high damage, leaving a large AoE spot where you land. Arc Titan has mainly 2 build options, one being Heart of Inmost Lights, where you just spam abilities, but is not as good as it once was, and the other being melee spam with Skullful or the newly buffed Point Contact Cannon Brace, and a pugilist weapon to get your melee back quickly. It isn't as viable as Heart of Inmost Light and power limited content, but in most of the game you'll be fine. You can also use Cuirass of the Falling Star for Thunder Crash damage, which you can just switch to before a damage phase in a raid. Arc Titan is very fun in most content for its incredibly effective ability spam and damage, but falls slightly in power limited content. However, that is mainly just in high level strikes and is still very potent. Arc Titan is also an excellent pick and raid for Thunder Crash's high damage, allowing you to quickly get back to weapon damage. Overall, making Arc Titan a very versatile, good and fun subclass. Now, all these changes are generally for the betterment of the game, allowing for more subclass customization and integration. They made abilities significantly more potent to the point that arguably used more than your guns and most endgame viable builds, making the game more of an ability fest than a looter shooter, which I personally think makes the game generally less interesting. The pure potency of ability spam also makes the game a lot easier. For example, this week I was running Grandmaster Nightfalls and playing extremely aggressive and messing around with Vesper of Radius, getting 10 to 13 minute clears without much effort, as we're basically invulnerable in our rifts, and Arc Souls just kill everything faster than our weapons can. You also have a 0 downtime on your rifts, whereas with Electrostatic Mind you'll just get ionic traces from killing all the blinded enemies and get it back instantly. So I think Bungie needs to put some serious work into tuning abilities down, as we are way too powerful currently, especially with max resilience. It is also caused encounters to be designed differently, as seen with Ghosts of the Deep. As most builds involve invulnerability, Bungie has resorted to one-shotting the player with hordes of Lucent Moths in low cover arenas to create a sort of challenge. Which is similar to what they did in Reckoning, where they also relied on one-shotting a player outside of Well by knocking them out of it or off of the map. So, those are my thoughts on the PvE side of the 3.0s. I will try to get out the PvP side in a reasonable amount of time, as I plan to have an entire paragraph detailing the exact reasons of why Arc Titan should be disabled in PvP until it is completely reworked, and we should never see anything as powerful as it ever again. Until then, I hope you enjoyed my ramblings. Please subscribe if you did, and adios.